I never thought a patch of empty dirt would turn into a 5-year war, but that's exactly what happened. It all started because I owned the vacant lot next to my house, a half-acre of grass and a few stubborn oak trees that I kept mowed and tidy. For me, it was a buffer, a guarantee that my closest neighbor on that side would always be a comfortable 100 yards away. For the woman who eventually tried to ruin my life, it was a blank canvas for her petty dictatorship. My name is Mark. I've lived in Oak Creek Crossing for 15 years. I run a small excavation and landscaping business, which means I spend my days shaping the earth for other people. I dig foundations, grade driveways, and install septic systems. It's hard, honest work, and it's given me a good life. I bought my house here because it was quiet. The lots were spacious, the neighbors kept to themselves, but were friendly enough to wave, and the homeowners association was, for the longest time, a joke. It existed on paper, collected a token fee once a year to maintain the front entrance sign, and that was it. It was perfect. The neighborhood itself was a mix of families, retirees, and working folks like me. We had an unspoken agreement: be decent, don't be a nuisance, and handle your own business. If someone's lawn got a little long, nobody cared. If a holiday decoration stayed up a week too late, the world didn't end. It was a community built on mutual respect, not on a 3-inch thick binder of regulations. That all changed the day Carol moved in. She bought the house across the street and 2 down from me. From the moment her moving truck arrived, she carried herself with an air of unearned authority. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a helmet of perfectly lacquered hair and a rotating collection of pastel pantsuits that made her look like she was perpetually on her way to a daytime television show taping. She had an opinion on everything, and she wasn't shy about sharing it. Within 6 months, she had somehow maneuvered her way onto the HOA board, a feat achieved mostly because no one else wanted the job. A year later, she was president. That's when the notices started. At first, they were small, almost laughable. A memo went out dictating that all mailboxes had to be a specific model of black powder-coated steel, purchased from a single approved vendor. Mine was a sturdy, custom-built brick enclosure, which I'd constructed myself. It was now, apparently, a violation. Then came the edict on lawn ornaments. Gnomes were out. Flamingos were forbidden. The little decorative windmills Mrs. Gable down the street loved so much were deemed tacky and inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic. People grumbled. There was a lot of eye-rolling and muttering during morning walks, but nobody did anything. It was easier to just buy the new mailbox or put the gnome in the garage. These were minor annoyances, and Carol, for all her bluster, was just one person. We tolerated her because fighting seemed like more trouble than it was worth. We still believed in the old ways of the neighborhood, assuming that if we just ignored the problem, it would eventually go away. We were wrong. Her appetite for control was just getting started, and my quiet, empty lot was about to become her main course. The real trouble began not with a snowstorm, but with a sunny spring day and Carol's ambition. The HOA, under her new iron-fisted leadership, announced a community beautification initiative. This was her grand project, her legacy. It involved planting new flowers at the entrance, pressuring people to repaint their trim, and, as I would soon discover, identifying and repurposing underutilized land. My vacant half-acre, which I saw as a peaceful green space, she saw as a blight. I first realized I was in her crosshairs when I came home one afternoon and found a small wooden stake with a bright pink ribbon tied to it hammered into the ground, right in the middle of my lot. It was a survey marker. I knew what it was because I used them in my own work. Someone was planning to build something. I pulled it out of the ground, tossed it in the bed of my truck, and didn't think much more of it. I figured it was a mistake. The next evening, as I was unloading some tools, Carol's car, a pristine white sedan that was always clean, pulled up to my curb. She didn't get out. She just rolled down the passenger window and beckoned to me with a single imperious finger. I sighed, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked over. This was not going to be a pleasant conversation. I could feel it in my bones. "Mark," she began, her voice smooth, but with a sharp metallic edge. "We seem to have a problem." "Do we, Carol?" I asked, leaning against my truck door trying to project an aura of casual indifference. Yes, the survey marker that was placed on the adjacent parcel was removed. That was HOA property. I held up my hand. Hold on. First, it's not an adjacent parcel. It's my lot. I own it. Second, anything placed on my property without my permission is trash, and I dispose of my trash as I see fit. Was there anything else? Her smile was thin and cold. It didn't reach her eyes. That lot has been an undeveloped eyesore for years. It detracts from the community's property values. The board has voted to take action. I stared at her, my initial annoyance curdling into disbelief. Take action? What are you talking about? It's a mowed lawn. How does a mowed lawn detract from anything? It's unproductive, she said, as if that explained everything. The beautification committee has decided it's the perfect location for the new community playground. The equipment has already been ordered. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a laugh, completely involuntary. A playground? On my property? Carol, are you out of your mind? You can't just build things on private land. This was the moment the mask of civility dropped. Her face hardened, and her voice lost its faux neighborly tone, replaced by the grating certainty of a bureaucrat who has found the perfect rule to weaponize. Read your covenants, Mark. Article 7, Section 4. The Architectural Control Committee has the authority to ensure all lots are maintained to a standard that is harmonious with the overall aesthetic and welfare of the community. The board has deemed your lot to be out of harmony. It is a neglected space. It's not neglected, it's empty. I own it. I pay taxes on it. You and your committee of busybodies don't get to decide what I do with it, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to keep it level. This is when she delivered the threat, the line that drew the map for the entire war to come. The covenants are clear, she said, her eyes glinting. The HOA has the right to remedy violations. We can perform the necessary improvements to bring a lot into compliance and then bill the owner for the costs incurred. If the owner refuses to pay, we place a lien. We are improving your property, and you will pay for it. The first earth-moving equipment arrives on Monday. I suggest you don't interfere. She rolled up her window without waiting for a response, the electric motor's hum sounding like a final, smug punctuation mark. She put the car in drive and glided away, leaving me standing in my own driveway, dust and disbelief swirling in her wake. I looked over at my peaceful, empty lot, the grass green in the evening sun, and I understood. This wasn't about a playground. It was about power, and she had just declared war on the wrong man. The weekend was a blur of frustration and simmering anger. I spent Saturday morning planting a neat row of no trespassing signs along the property line of the lot. They were professional-grade metal signs on sturdy posts, impossible to miss. I figured that would be enough to give any contractor pause. On Sunday morning, they were gone. All of them. Not just pulled up, but vanished entirely. I walked the perimeter and found nothing but the holes where they had been. It was a clear, deliberate message. Monday morning came, and sure enough, a small bulldozer on a flatbed trailer rumbled down our street just after sunrise. I was already out there, a folding chair and a large thermos of coffee my only weapons. I had parked my heavy-duty work truck, a 3/4-ton beast, directly in front of the only practical access point to the lot. The driver of the bulldozer, a grizzled guy in a stained t-shirt, looked at my truck, looked at me sitting in the chair, and shut off his rig. He ambled over. "You the owner?" he grunted. "I am," I said calmly, "and this is private property. You're not welcome here." He shrugged. "Lady from the HOA told me it was all cleared, said the owner was on board." "The lady was mistaken," I replied, taking a slow sip of coffee. "If you bring that machine onto my land, I will call the sheriff and have you charged with trespassing and property damage." He held his hands up in surrender. "Hey, no skin off my nose, man. I don't get paid enough to get into fights." He made a call, and I could hear him explaining the situation. A few minutes later, he climbed back into his truck and rumbled away. It was a small victory, but it felt good. It didn't last. The next day, the first official letter arrived. It was printed on fancy HOA letterhead, thick paper that felt important. It was a formal notice of violation, citing the same harmony clause Carol had spewed at me. It detailed my failure to develop the parcel in a timely manner and informed me that a fine of $50 per day was now being levied against my account. It ended with a chillingly cheerful line. "We look forward to breaking ground on the Oak Creek Crossing Community Playground soon." I tried talking to some of my neighbors. Most were sympathetic but wary. "She's on a power trip, Mark," one of them told me over the fence. "But I can't get involved. She's already fined me twice because my garden hose wasn't coiled correctly. I just pay it. It's easier." They were intimidated. Years of quiet apathy had left them unprepared for a fight. The conflict started to affect more than just me. Mail delivery became sporadic because Carol had decreed that the mail carrier was not allowed to get out of their vehicle, and some of the new approved mailboxes were placed in spots the carrier couldn't reach. The school bus route was altered after she sent a complaint to the district about the bus stopping in a non-designated area, forcing kids to walk an extra quarter-mile to a new stop. She was disrupting the entire fabric of the neighborhood for the sake of her own rigid sense of order. My most steadfast supporter was Mrs. Gable, a widow in her late 70s who had lived in Oak Creek Crossing since the first houses were built. She was a sweet, sharp-as-a-tack woman who had seen it all. She called me the evening I got the first fine. "Don't you let that woman bully you, Mark," she said, her voice crackling with indignation. She sent me a notice saying my bird feeders were attracting undesirable wildlife. "I've had those feeders up for 30 years. This isn't the neighborhood anymore. It's a petty tyranny." Her support meant the world to me. She was the living memory of what our community used to be, and she was just as angry as I was about what it was becoming. The fines kept coming, $50 a day. After a week, the second letter arrived, this one informing me my outstanding balance was $350 and that failure to pay would result in further action. It was absurd. It was infuriating. I was being fined for owning empty land. I knew I couldn't fight this alone with a folding chair and a thermos. Carol was using the HOA's structure and its funds as a weapon, and I needed a professional shield. That's when I called Ben Carter. He was a lawyer whose name I got from a contractor I worked with. The recommendation was simple. If you've got a property dispute, you want Ben. He's a bulldog who looks like a librarian. It was an apt description. Ben was a young guy, maybe early 30s, with thick glasses and a slightly rumpled suit. But when he started talking, his voice was filled with a confident, precise energy. I laid out the whole story in his office, a room piled high with books and property plats. I showed him the deed to my lot, the violation notices, and pictures of my no trespassing signs. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, a small smile playing on his lips. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Well, Mark, this is a classic case of what I like to call petty tyrant syndrome. You've got an HOA president who has just discovered the intoxicating thrill of wielding power, however small." "So what can I do?" I asked. "Can we sue them? Get an injunction?" Ben tapped a pen on the thick HOA covenant document I'd brought. "We could, but it would be a long and expensive fight. These covenants are deliberately vague. A judge might side with you, or they might say it's a contractual matter for the HOA to decide. It's a coin toss. A frontal assault is risky." He paused, looking at me over the top of his glasses. "But Carol has given us a gift. Her arrogance is her weakness. She's so sure she's right that she's going to overstep, massively. She's already threatened to build a playground on my land and send me the bill," I said. Ben's smile widened. "Exactly, and we're going to let her." I must have looked at him like he was crazy. Let her? Let her trespass and build on my property? Mark, right now, it's your word against hers. It's a dispute over fines. But if she actually builds a permanent structure on your land, that's not a dispute anymore. That's a clear, undeniable, and very expensive mistake on her part. She's not just breaking the HOA rules then. She's breaking state and federal property law. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "So, here's what we do. We don't fight the fines. We don't send any more angry letters. We go quiet. You're going to document everything. Set up a camera. Keep a log. Let her think she's won. Let her get that bulldozer back. Let her build her monument to her own ego. And when she's done, we're not going to sue her to tear it down. We're going to send her a bill. The strategy was so counterintuitive, so audacious, that I couldn't help but be intrigued. It felt like a chess move in a game of checkers. So, I agreed. That evening, I went to a sporting goods store and bought a high-quality trail camera, the kind hunters use. It was motion-activated and had night vision. I mounted it high in one of the oak trees on my property line, perfectly concealed by the leaves, with a clear view of the entire vacant lot. My investigation had begun. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was setting a trap. For the next few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over the neighborhood. The daily fines continued to accrue in letters I now filed away in a folder labeled Carol's Folly. I had to go out of state for a 10-day job, a big project installing a complex drainage system for a new commercial development. I was nervous about leaving, but Ben had been clear. Don't change your routine. Let her feel emboldened by your absence. Mrs. Gable promised to keep an eye on things for me. The calls started on day 3 of my trip. "Mark, it's Helen Gable," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and alarm. "They're here. The bulldozer is back, and there's a crew of men with it." "Don't do anything, Mrs. Gable," I said, my heart pounding. "Just watch. Is the camera still there?" "As far as I can tell, they don't seem to have noticed it." She called me every day after that with updates. The crew had graded a large, level area in the center of the lot. They'd brought in a truckload of wood chips and spread them out. Then, a large flatbed arrived, with brightly colored metal and plastic components. They were assembling the playground. My trail camera was capturing it all. Every bolt, every post, every single act of trespass. In a way, it was a beautiful thing. Carol was building my legal case for me, piece by piece. When I finally returned home late on a Friday night, the job was complete. I pulled into my driveway and just sat in my truck for a full 5 minutes, staring. There, on my lot, under the glow of a nearby streetlight, stood a brand new playground. It had a slide, 2 swings, a small climbing wall, and one of those springy ride-on horses. It was surrounded by a neat border of railroad ties and a thick bed of fresh wood chips. They had even installed a bench. It was, I had to admit, a nice-looking playground, and it was sitting squarely on my land. I walked over to it, my boots crunching on the gravel of my own driveway. There was a sign hammered into the ground near the entrance, a professionally printed one with the Oak Creek Crossing logo. It read, "Welcome to the Oak Creek Playground, a community improvement project. Hours, sunrise to sunset. Play safely." They hadn't just built on my land, they had opened a public facility on it. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Carol hadn't just overstepped, she had pole vaulted over the line of legality and landed in a pit of her own making. My anger was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of purpose. The defensive phase was over. It was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I didn't storm over to Carol's house. I didn't call the sheriff. I called Ben. I described the scene to him, the playground, the sign, everything. I could hear the smile in his voice. "It's better than I ever could have hoped for, Mark. She's gift-wrapped our entire case. Now don't talk to anyone. Don't post any more signs. Let the neighborhood kids use it for the weekend. We want to establish that it's operating as a public park." "And then what?" I asked. "And then," he said, his voice full of relish, "we send the letter." Ben drafted it himself. It was a masterpiece of legal jiu-jitsu. We sent it via certified mail on Monday morning, addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, care of Carol. It wasn't a cease and desist. It wasn't a threat of a lawsuit. It was, on its surface, a letter of acceptance. It began, "Dear Board of Directors, it has come to my attention that you have recently completed the installation of a commercial-grade playground structure on my private property located at address of the lot. I acknowledge this significant and permanent improvement to my land." The letter went on to state that since the HOA had taken it upon themselves to build and operate a facility on my property without a prior agreement, I was classifying the situation as an unauthorized but de facto tenancy. As the landowner, and now, by default, the landlord, I was happy to allow the playground to remain for the benefit of the community under a few simple conditions. First, we were establishing a monthly lease for the use of the land. Ben had researched comparable land lease rates for commercial activities in our county and had come up with a figure that was both legally defensible and painfully high. Second, there was a one-time site preparation and unsolicited improvement fee, which was a polite way of billing them for the damage their bulldozer had done to my lot's ecosystem and turf. Third, and this was Ben's stroke of genius, the lease was retroactive to the date their crew first broke ground, payable immediately. The final paragraph was the real killer. It stated that as the landlord leasing property for a public recreational purpose, I required the tenant, the HOA, to provide me with a copy of their liability insurance policy. Specifically, a policy with a minimum of $2 million in coverage, which explicitly covered public playground injuries and named me, Mark Jansen, as an additional insured party. Failure to provide proof of this insurance within 10 business days would constitute a breach of the lease, and the playground would be considered an uninsured attractive nuisance, for which the board members could be held personally liable. We sent the letter, and we waited. The response didn't take long. About a week later, another thick envelope from the HOA arrived. This one was not a form letter. It was a blistering 2-page tirade, almost certainly written by Carol herself. It called my letter preposterous, extortionate, and a pathetic attempt to profit from the community's generosity. It stated that not only would they refuse to pay a single penny of my absurd demands, but they were now adding the full cost of the playground construction, a tidy sum of over $25,000, to my account of unpaid fines. A formal lien against both of my properties, my house and the lot, would be filed with the county if the full amount was not paid within 30 days. Perfect, Ben said when I read it to him over the phone. She took the bait. She put it all in writing. Now we go public. The next general HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. It was usually a sleepy affair, held in the rented conference room of a nearby library, attended by Carol, her 2 cronies on the board, and maybe 4 or 5 other residents. But this time was going to be different. Mrs. Gable, armed with the story of the playground and a list of other residents who had been fined for petty infractions, had become a reluctant community organizer. She made calls, she knocked on doors, she told everyone, "You need to be at this meeting. Mark is going to stand up to her and he needs our support." The night of the meeting, the conference room was packed. I'd never seen anything like it. There were at least 50 people there, crammed into chairs, standing along the walls. The air was thick with anticipation and resentment. Carol, seated at the head table with her 2 board allies, looked momentarily flustered by the crowd, but quickly regained her composure, a smug, combative look settling on her face. She clearly saw this as an opportunity to publicly humiliate me and solidify her power. I sat in the front row with Ben at my side. He had a slim briefcase on his lap. He looked calm, academic, and utterly harmless. Carol opened the meeting with the usual formalities, but then she skipped right to the main event. "As many of you know," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "the HOA has made a wonderful new addition to our community, the beautiful playground on the formerly derelict lot at the corner of Oak and Elm. It was a project undertaken for the benefit of our children." She paused for effect. "Unfortunately, one resident, Mr. Mark Jansen, has decided to try and extort this community. He wants to charge us rent for the land we so generously improved for him. He has refused to pay his fines and has now sent a list of ludicrous demands." She held up my letter. "He is demanding thousands of dollars and is attempting to hold our children's playground hostage." A murmur went through the crowd. I could feel some people looking at me with doubt. "Therefore," she concluded, her voice ringing with triumph, "the board has voted to place a lien on Mr. Jansen's property for the full cost of the playground and all outstanding fines, a total of $31,450. Are there any questions?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Ben stood up. He walked calmly to the small lectern set up for public comments. "Yes, I have a few," he said politely. "My name is Ben Carter. I am Mr. Jansen's legal counsel. Carol's eyes narrowed. Lawyers are not permitted to speak for residents at these meetings. Actually, Madam President, your own bylaws state that any member in good standing can yield their speaking time to a designated representative. I believe that's Article 4, Section 9, Ben replied smoothly, without even glancing at a document. Mr. Jansen yields his time to me. Checkmate. Carol's face flushed a deep, angry red. She couldn't argue with her own rules. She gestured curtly for him to proceed. Ben opened his briefcase and pulled out a thin file. Let's clear up a few things. First, the matter of ownership. He held up a document. This is a certified copy of the deed for the lot in question. It is owned, free and clear, by my client, Mark Jansen. It is not common area. It is not derelict land. It is private property, the same as the land your own house sits on. He placed it on the lectern and pulled out a stack of glossy photos. Second, the matter of the installation. He held up a picture, a crystal clear shot from my trail camera showing the bulldozer tearing up the grass. This is the HOA's contracted crew trespassing on my client's property. He held up another. This is the crew installing the equipment after my client's no trespassing signs were illegally removed. He held up a third. And this is the finished playground operating as a public park on private land without the owner's consent. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, looking from the photos to Carol, whose smug expression was beginning to crack. Third, Ben continued, his voice still calm and even. Let's talk about the covenants you're so fond of quoting. I have read them, all 120 pages, and while the harmony clause you mentioned is indeed in there, no court in this country would interpret it as granting you the right to seize private property and build a permanent structure on it. What you did was not a remedy, it was a criminal act. Specifically, trespass and destruction of property. He then held up the letter I had sent, the one Carol had called extortionate. My client, being a reasonable man, offered you a way out. He offered to let the playground stay, for the good of the community he's been a part of for 15 years. All he asked for was a fair lease agreement, which is standard business practice, and for the HOA to assume the proper legal and financial responsibility for the facility you built. Now he looked directly at the crowd. And this brings me to my final and most important point: liability. The room went quiet. You see, Ben explained, when you operate a public playground, you take on an enormous amount of risk. What happens if a child falls and breaks an arm? What happens if there's a structural failure? Your standard HOA liability policy does not cover this. You need a special rider, a very expensive one, for recreational facilities. I know you don't have it because I called your insurance carrier this morning. They confirmed it. He turned his gaze back to the head table, letting it rest on each of the 3 board members. Right now, this HOA is operating an uninsured, unlicensed public park on land it does not own. Should an accident happen, the lawyers for the injured party wouldn't just sue the HOA. They would sue the board members who authorized this project, personally. They would come after your houses, your savings, your retirement accounts. A collective gasp went through the room. The 2 board members sitting next to Carol went pale. One of them looked like he was going to be sick. But it gets worse, Ben said, delivering the final devastating blow. Because the playground is on my client's land without a contract, he is also exposed to that liability. Which means that in addition to the state, the county, and the parents of any injured child, you would also be sued by us. For negligence, for endangerment, and for putting my client's entire financial future at risk. Carol finally found her voice. It was a high-pitched, sputtering shriek. This is ridiculous. You're trying to scare people. The covenants protect us. The board acted in good faith. Did you? Ben asked softly. Did you get a legal opinion before you spent $25,000 of your members' money to build this? Did you get a quote for the insurance? Did you even perform a simple title search on the property? He looked at the 2 other board members. Did she tell you the land was private property? Or did she tell you it was derelict land you had a right to? The dam broke. One of the board members, a man named Gary, slammed his hand on the table. "She told us it was common area. She said it had reverted to the HOA because the owner wasn't paying his dues." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting at Carol. "You lied to us! You used our money for this? What were you thinking?" Carol stood up, her face a mask of pure rage and disbelief. Her authority, so absolute just minutes before, had completely disintegrated. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He is the problem. He is ruining this community." But no one was listening to her anymore. They were listening to the truth. Ben let the chaos swell for a moment before raising his hand for quiet. "My client does not want to see this community bankrupted," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "He does not want to sue his neighbors. He is still willing to accept the terms of his original letter. A fair lease and the proper insurance. That is the only path forward that doesn't involve a courtroom." "However," he added, looking at the treasurer's report on the table, "we have also uncovered some irregularities in the HOA's accounting, specifically regarding the contract for this playground. The company you hired seems to be owned by your brother-in-law, Carol, and their bid was nearly 40% higher than the industry standard. We will be turning that information over to the district attorney's office for a formal investigation into fraud and embezzlement." That was it, the final nail. Carol stared at him, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Then she grabbed her purse, turned, and practically ran from the room, pushing through the crowd of her stunned and furious neighbors. The reign of the petty tyrant was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. In the vacuum of Carol's panicked flight, the meeting descended into a sort of chaotic but productive emergency session. Gary, the board member who had called out Carol's lie, immediately tendered his resignation, as did the other remaining member. Mrs. Gable, to her own surprise, was nominated from the floor to head an interim committee to sort out the mess. The motion passed with a unanimous roar of approval. The revolution was complete. The very next day, I received a call from Mrs. Gable. Her voice was tired but firm. "Mark, the interim committee would like to meet with you and your lawyer as soon as possible. We need to make this right." We met that evening in the same library conference room, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. It was just me, Ben, Mrs. Gable, and two other longtime residents she'd recruited. There were no accusations, no posturing. They laid the HOA's books on the table, which were a mess, and asked for our help. My vindication was total and complete. On Ben's advice, the new committee's first official act was to draft a formal resolution. It rescinded all fines levied against me, voided the illegal $31,000 lien, and issued a formal apology on behalf of the community. Their second act was to sign the lease agreement Ben and I had drafted. They agreed to the monthly rate, the retroactive back payment for the time the playground had already been on my land, and the one-time fee for damages. I had a check in my hand for the first lump sum before I left the meeting. Most importantly, they immediately began the process of securing the proper liability insurance, with the policy naming me as an additional insured party. They understood the gravity of the situation Ben had laid out. Within 2 weeks, I had a certificate of insurance in my possession, and the playground on my lot went from being a massive liability to a fully insured, income-generating asset. All the fines Carol had levied against other residents for things like bird feeders and coiled hoses were also voided. A wave of sanity and reason washed back over Oak Creek Crossing. The community reformation was profound. The interim committee, led by Mrs. Gable, began the painstaking process of untangling the web of mismanagement and malice Carol had woven. They hired an independent auditor who conducted a full review of the HOA's finances from the past 2 years. The findings were worse than we had imagined. The audit confirmed that the playground contractor was indeed Carol's brother-in-law. The contract had been awarded without a competitive bidding process, and the price was grossly inflated. But it went deeper. Carol had been using the HOA's debit card for personal expenses, gas, groceries, even a few spa treatments, all coded under vague categories like community supplies or administrative expenses. She had been skimming from the dues of the very people she terrorized. It wasn't just a power trip, it was a grift. True to his word, Ben packaged the auditor's report, along with our own documentation of the playground fiasco, and delivered it to the district attorney's office. An official criminal investigation was launched. Carol was formally charged with felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Her downfall was as spectacular as her reign had been infuriating. The local paper ran a story about the HOA president from hell, and her mugshot was plastered all over the evening news. Her trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. Her own board members testified against her. The paper trail was undeniable. She was convicted on all counts. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of her brazen abuse of a position of trust and her callous disregard for her neighbors. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the Oak Creek Crossing HOA. Justice, when it finally arrived, was thorough. With Carol gone and a new, sensible board in place, the neighborhood began to heal. The draconian rules were systematically dismantled. The covenant about mailboxes was repealed. The ban on gnomes was lifted. Mrs. Gable's bird feeders went back up, and the sound of finches and cardinals returned to her yard. The HOA went back to being what it was supposed to be, a simple entity for managing essential shared interests, not a tool for personal vendettas. The spirit of community, which had been suppressed but never extinguished, re-emerged, stronger than before. We had faced a common enemy and won, and it brought us closer. 5 years passed. The neighborhood thrived. The ugly chapter of Carol's reign faded into a cautionary tale told to new residents. Property values, which had stagnated under her bizarre rules, began to climb steadily. Oak Creek Crossing became known not for its restrictive covenants, but for its friendly atmosphere and strong community bonds. The playground on my lot became a beloved fixture, a place where the neighborhood kids grew up, their laughter a constant, pleasant soundtrack to the quiet life I had fought to protect. The 5-year lease I had signed with the HOA was coming to an end. Every month for 60 straight months, a check had arrived in my mailbox, a quiet reminder of the battle I had won. The income had been nice, more than paying the property taxes on the lot with plenty left over. It was, as Ben had once joked, the most profitable patch of dirt in the county. One afternoon, I was at the local grocery store, grabbing a few things for dinner. As I rounded the corner of the dairy aisle, I saw her. It was Carol. I hadn't seen her since her sentencing. The prison term and the public humiliation had taken their toll. Her signature helmet of hair was gone, replaced by a shorter, duller cut showing streaks of gray. The sharp, tailored pantsuit was gone, replaced by a drab, ill-fitting tracksuit. She looked smaller, diminished, the fire of her self-righteousness completely extinguished. She saw me at the same moment. A flicker of panic crossed her face, and she seemed to consider turning her cart and fleeing. But she didn't. She just stood there, looking at the floor. I gave a slight nod, intending to just walk past. I felt no anger towards her anymore, just a kind of detached pity. She had been the architect of her own destruction. "Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I stopped. Carol. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at a carton of milk in her cart. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry," she mumbled, "for everything." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a moment of profound revelation. It was the quiet, pathetic admission of a defeated bully. There was nothing to be gained from rubbing it in. The war was long over. "I appreciate that," I said, and it was true. I appreciated that she had been humbled enough to say it. I pushed my cart past her and finished my shopping. There was no catharsis, no feeling of final victory, just the quiet closing of a book. The story of the playground became a lesson I often reflect on. It's a story about the insidious nature of petty power, how a little bit of authority in the wrong hands can curdle into tyranny. Carol wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was just a person who loved rules more than she loved people, who saw control as an end in itself. She believed the binder of regulations gave her the right to impose her will on others, and she was blinded by the conviction that she was always, unequivocally, right. It's also a story about the strength of community. For a long time, we were all guilty of apathy. We let the small aggressions slide because it was easier than fighting back. But when pushed too far, when the threat became undeniable, we found our collective voice. We remembered that a neighborhood is defined by the people in it, not by the rules written on a page. We learned that standing together, armed with reason and the simple truth, is the most powerful weapon against any bully. Tyrants, big or small, thrive on intimidation and division. They crumble when confronted with a united, informed populace. My life has largely returned to the way it was before Carol ever moved in. I run my business. I work the earth. I enjoy the peace and quiet of my home. The new HOA board, still led by the wonderfully pragmatic Mrs. Gable, contacted me last month. The lease on the playground was expiring. They respectfully asked if I would be willing to negotiate a new one. They came prepared with a fair market analysis and a proposal that was reasonable and professional. We have a meeting scheduled for next week. I think I'll say yes. Sometimes, I stand at my kitchen window, looking out at the lot next door. I see the colorful playground, the wood chips worn down by thousands of running feet. I hear the rhythmic creak of the swings and the sound of children's laughter drifting on the breeze. It's a constant reminder of a fight I never wanted, a war over a half-acre of grass. It's a monument not to Carol's ego, as she intended, but to the simple, enduring power of reason, fairness, and a community that finally decided to stand up for itself. And then I turn back to my coffee, another day of honest work ahead of me, content in the quiet competence that defines my life, in a neighborhood that I helped save. The peace is worth more than any lease payment.